Trapped in a dark mansion, she discovers that behind the cruel reputation lies a man marked by secrets, pain, and oaths that bind him to an implacable destiny.
The town was small and surrounded by mountains. The streets were narrow, paved with ancient stones, and the wind carried the scent of rust and rain. Everything there seemed frozen, as if time itself had stopped out of fear of something. People spoke in whispers, glanced over their shoulders, and shut their windows before the sun completely disappeared. They said it was because of him, the man who came when the bell rang. No one knew the face hidden beneath the black hood. Some said he was a killer. Others swore he was merely an agent of justice. But in that place, justice and death had always walked hand in hand. Aurora had grown up hearing those stories. As a child, she thought they were legends made to frighten her. Now, as an adult, she realized people spoke with genuine fear. Whenever someone vanished, whenever a debt went unpaid or a betrayal was uncovered, the church bell would ring 3 times. And after that silence, her father used to say that certain things were not meant to be questioned. He was a respected man, firm in his posture but cold. He rarely smiled. When he looked at his daughter, it was as if he carried a burden she could never understand. Their house sat high on the hill, surrounded by walls and old trees. Aurora would spend her afternoons on the veranda, watching the town below. She liked seeing the market, the children running, the wagons passing by. But she also felt the invisible tension that hung over everything. Every wary glance, every conversation that stopped when she drew near. One morning, while walking down to the town square, she overheard 2 women whispering near a fruit stand. "It was him again," one said. Without looking up, "The man with the cloak?" asked the other. "They rang the bell. They say it was a thief this time." Aurora pretended to examine the fruit, but she caught every word. His name was never spoken aloud. He was only ever called him or that man, as if merely speaking it might summon him on her way home. She couldn't shake the thought. At every corner, she felt watched. Maybe it was just her imagination, but something in that town pressed down on her chest, as if the air itself was made of secrets. When she got home, she asked the housekeeper what she knew about the man in the hood. The woman, always cautious, answered without meeting her eyes, "It's best you don't get involved, child. He's the one who keeps this town standing, by paying the price no one else wants to pay." Aurora fell silent. The answer didn't make sense, but the tone was enough to silence any further questions. That night, during dinner, she noticed her father was tense. He received visitors, often men in dark clothes and grave expressions. She didn't know exactly what they discussed, only that it was about business, debts, and old agreements. She would listen from the staircase, trying to understand what they meant by the price everyone seemed to fear. "The agreement stands," said one of the visitors, "and you know what happens if it's broken." Her father didn't respond. He simply nodded, his gaze heavy. Aurora backed away quietly, her heart pounding. "Agreement. Debt." Those words echoed like the whispers she'd heard in the market, and at the center of them all the name no one dared to say. The following days grew strange. The town's atmosphere shifted. The church bell rang twice in a single week, something no one could remember happening before. People avoided going out at night and during Mass. The priests begged everyone to pray for the salvation of their souls. Aurora began to sleep poorly. Sometimes she woke in the middle of the night with the feeling that someone was watching her. Shadows seemed to move along the walls, and the distant sound of hooves echoed outside. One afternoon, she decided to walk alone to the central square. She needed air to see human faces, to hear voices that weren't whispering. But what she found was a town in silence. Shops were open, but no one spoke. People avoided eye contact. As she turned a corner, an old woman called out to her. Her eyes were pale, her expression feverish. "You're the daughter of the man on the hill, aren't you?" Aurora nodded. "Then you should know blood always collects what it's owed." "What do you mean by that?" The woman only smiled, a toothless, knowing smile. "He comes to settle the debts. He always has, and he always will." Before Aurora could ask more, the old woman walked away, disappearing into the fog. That evening, the sunset lingered unnaturally long, and the cold wind carried the distant sound of bells. 3 chimes. Aurora moved to the window and saw torches flickering in the streets. A group of men carried something covered by a dark cloth. People stepped aside, made the sign of the cross, and no one dared speak. In the middle of them stood a single figure. Tall, still, the black hood concealing his face. Aurora felt her body shiver. She didn't know what she expected to see. A monster, perhaps, but there was something different about that presence. A frightening calm, almost solemn. He looked like a man carrying the weight of all others. Her gaze locked onto him until he lifted his head. For an instant, she had the unmistakable feeling he was looking straight at her window. She stumbled back, her heart pounding too fast. The bell stopped. Silence returned, but fear remained. In the following days, her father became more withdrawn. He spent hours locked in his study, writing letters and burning papers in the fireplace. Aurora tried not to show curiosity, but something within her had begun to stir. With every toll of the bell, it felt as though the town's fate and hers was moving closer to something inevitable. One night, she heard voices coming from her father's study. She crept closer and pressed her ear to the door. "The time is running out," someone said. "He'll come to claim what's his." Her father answered in a weary tone, "So be it." Aurora stepped back, confused. Claim what's his who? The man in the hood. Lying in bed that night, she stared at the ceiling until dawn. She didn't know what was coming, but she felt that the town hid something far greater than rumor, something that pulsed through the veins of everyone there, including her own. Aurora had always believed fear was something distant, belonging to others. But now she realized fear lived inside the houses, in the restrained gestures, in the hurried prayers before dinner, and in the memory of that gaze beneath the hood. The morning began like any other. The distant sound of carriages on the street, the church bells ringing, and the smell of fresh bread drifting from the square. Aurora came down the stairs, still half asleep, unaware that this would be the day everything changed. Her father sat at the table, his gaze fixed on a glass of wine. Her mother, silent, stirred a pot that was already boiling on the stove. There was a heaviness in the air, the kind of silence that screams before tragedy. Aurora noticed immediately. Her father only looked that way when he had something to say but didn't want to. She tried to smile, asked if something had happened, but he only motioned for her to sit. Her mother's spoon stopped stirring. In that small pause, that suspended second, Aurora felt her heart tighten. "You're getting married," he said flatly, without preamble, without meeting her eyes. Aurora laughed, thinking it was a joke, but his tone left no room for lightness. "Married? To whom?" "To the executioner." The world seemed to stop. The words echoed in her head like a slow thunder, too heavy to believe. Her laughter died. She looked at her mother, waiting for a reaction, a denial, anything that could make it all untrue. But her mother looked away. "This is absurd." Aurora stood, her entire body trembling. "He's a murderer." Her father finally raised his head, his face worn and aged by something she couldn't name. "It's the price, daughter. The debt must be paid." She stepped back, confused. "Debt? What debt?" he explained, voice hoarse, every word falling like a burden too heavy to carry. Years ago, during a conflict that tore the city apart, he was saved by a man wearing the hood of the executioners. A pact was made, his life, in exchange for the promise to give up his firstborn daughter when the time came. Aurora froze. The windows were open, and the cold wind slipped in, making the candle's flame shiver. She wanted to believe it was madness, some old superstition. But there, under her father's dark, defeated gaze, she knew there was no escape. "This is monstrous," she whispered. "I am not part of any debt." He didn't answer. He only gripped his glass so tightly the rim cracked. Aurora ran upstairs, tears burning her eyes. She locked herself in her room for hours, unmoving, listening to the sounds of the city outside, so indifferent to what was happening inside her home. Outside, the sun still shone. Outside, people still smiled. But inside her, something had shattered in the days that followed. The news spread. On every corner, whispers, "His daughter is marrying the executioner. Poor girl, they say, no bride of his ever lasts long." The voices came from all sides, as if the very air fed on tragedy. Aurora began to feel the stares. She couldn't leave the house without people stepping aside or folding their arms in respect, or in fear. At night, the letters began to arrive. No sender. The seal was dark wax, stamped with the mark of a blade, the same symbol the executioners used on their weapons. None of them contained words, only blank pages. At first she thought it was a warning, some cruel mockery, but soon it began to feel like something else, a presence, watching, patient and silent. Each envelope left on the doorstep carried a weight, an unseen gaze. One afternoon, a messenger arrived, a tall man dressed in black, his posture belonging to someone who served something greater and more feared than himself. He carried a dark wooden box, which he handed to her father. Aurora, hiding behind the door, watched. When the man left, her father opened it. Inside lay a white veil and a ribbon of red silk, symbols of union, symbols of possession. Aurora stepped into the room, trembling with rage and despair. "I won't wear that. I'm not marrying him." Her father looked at her with tenderness and guilt. "You don't understand, my daughter. This pact isn't a choice. If I break it, he comes, and he kills us all." She recoiled, eyes brimming with tears. "So that's it. You'll hand me over to save yourself." No answer, only the sound of wind seeping through the cracks, and the truth that, in that city, promises were stronger than love. That night, Aurora tried to run. She put on a dark cloak and waited for silence. When the moon rose, she slipped out the back, crossing the yard and following the path to the hills. Her heart raced. With every step, she pictured the man they called the executioner, a shadowed figure. Cold eyes, hands marked by blood. But she didn't get far. At the edge of the road, a horse stood waiting, a man beside it. He wasn't wearing the hood, but she had seen him before, visiting her father. Her blood turned to ice. "Miss, running won't help," he said in a low, steady voice. She stepped back, trying to hide her fear. "I don't belong to him." "Not yet," he replied. "But destiny doesn't need your consent." Aurora ran back home without looking over her shoulder. When she arrived, her father was already at the door, pale and silent. On the ground lay another letter. This time, it wasn't blank. A single phrase, written in dark ink, there is no escape from a vow sealed in blood. She fell to her knees, feeling the weight of those words. For the first time, she understood what people meant when they spoke of him as a living legend. He wasn't merely a man, he was the consequence of a promise. The hand of fate that the city tried to forget, but never could. The days that followed were torment. Preparations began quietly, dresses delivered, strange visits, and the sound of hammers in the yard building something, maybe an altar. With each passing day, the inevitable drew closer. Aurora began to dream of him, faceless figures, voices whispering her name. Sometimes she woke to the sound of metal striking metal, as if someone was sharpening a blade inside her room. One morning, she opened her window and found another letter, but this time, there was a drawing, two hands intertwined, one covered in blood, the other in flowers. No words. She kept the paper, and for the first time, she felt something other than fear, a strange, dangerous curiosity. Who was this man who carried so many shadows, and yet remembered to send flowers? The wedding was set for the next lunar cycle. The entire city whispered about it. Some said the executioner hadn't been seen for months, that he lived alone in a house by the cliffs. Others swore they saw him in the square at night. Watching from afar, Aurora began to wander behind closed windows, watching the world without being seen. She wanted to hate him, but what grew inside her was more complicated than hate. It was the need to understand why he wanted her. On the last night before the ceremony, the wind blew hard and carried the veil from her bed. It flew out the window, disappearing into the dark. Aurora stood there, staring into the emptiness, feeling the cold night press against her skin. She knew there was no turning back. Dawn would bring not just a wedding but the beginning of something much greater, something neither she nor the executioner could ever control. The day of the wedding arrived, shrouded in fog. The city seemed suspended between fear and silence, as if even the wind dared not blow, afraid to draw attention. From early morning the sound of bells echoed through the streets, and people watched from their windows with the same expression one wears when a funeral procession passes by. Aurora had woken before dawn, her body trembling, her heart unsteady. She couldn't tell whether what she felt was terror or disbelief. In the mirror she saw a version of herself she didn't recognize. The white dress weighed on her like armor. The veil covered part of her face, and behind the thin fabric, her eyes looked like those of someone about to be delivered to fate. Around her, maids worked in silence, dressing her carefully. None dared to speak. It was as if they all knew this wasn't a wedding, it was a sentence. When her father entered the room, Aurora rose slowly. He couldn't bring himself to look at her. He approached, adjusted her veil with trembling hands, and murmured, "What's done cannot be undone." She wanted to hate him, but exhaustion had already replaced anger. She let herself be led outside, her steps slow, the sound of the dress dragging across the floor like the rustle of morning. Outside, the city waited, everyone lined along the sidewalks, staring with eyes that mixed pity, fear, and morbid curiosity. The ceremony took place in the old town hall, the same hall where, centuries ago, executions had been announced. The walls were of dark stone, and the high ceiling seemed to swallow sound. In the center stood a simple altar, lit only by candles. He was there, the executioner. Vladimir, standing motionless like a solid shadow. He wore a black coat of heavy fabric that seemed to absorb all the light in the room. His face, finally visible, wasn't what she'd imagined. There was no deformity, no overt cruelty, only beauty. A cold, distant beauty, almost untouchable. His eyes, a deep gray, watched everything without emotion, and yet something in them carried the weight of silence itself. Aurora stopped for a moment. Her heart quickened and she hated what she felt. It wasn't just fear, it was something else. Something that unsettled her. He inclined his head slightly when she approached, an almost respectful gesture, yet mechanical. He said nothing, simply observed her with that calm, unflinching gaze of someone who has watched the world bleed and learned not to tremble. The priest began the ceremony, his voice echoing through the cold stone. Words of union and blessing sounded hollow. Each sentence was a cruel irony. Aurora could feel the weight of every gaze upon her, watching, judging, as if witnessing a sacrifice. Some crossed themselves, others turned away, afraid to invite the same fate. When the time came to seal the vow, the priest hesitated. Vladimir drew a small silver blade from his coat. With precise motion, he cut his palm lightly. Blood trickled down slowly. Then he extended his hand to her. Aurora stepped back. His gaze never wavered, not angry, not impatient, only quietly expectant. The priest whispered that it was the ancient custom, the seal of the oath. She trembled, but raised her hand. The blade brushed her skin, a thin line of pain. When their blood mingled, the candles flickered, as if the air had grown heavier. The priest spoke the final words, declaring them husband and wife. There was no applause, no smiles. The ceremony ended with the distant tolling of bells, more warning than celebration. Vladimir didn't try to touch her. He only bowed his head slightly, as one fulfilling an obligation, and turned away. Aurora stood frozen, watching as he walked to the door. For a moment, the morning sun fell on him, and the contrast between light and black fabric made him look even more out of place, like a living shadow crossing into the realm of men. Outside, the townspeople bowed, some whispering prayers. He looked at no one. He mounted the dark horse waiting for him and remained still, watching the building from which she would emerge. Aurora hesitated, but her father gave her a gentle push. She walked toward Vladimir, feeling every stair burn into her back. When she reached him, he extended his hand, not tenderly, but as a command. She climbed onto the horse with his help, feeling the cold leather of his gloves against her skin. The journey to her new home was long. The sound of hooves echoed across the empty road. Aurora kept her eyes fixed on the horizon, refusing to meet his gaze. Yet his presence filled the space between them, heavy and unyielding like a shadow that never left. No words were spoken the entire way. When they reached the hill, she saw the house for the first time, an old stone mansion surrounded by twisted trees. The windows were tall and draped in dark curtains. The place breathed mystery and solitude. Vladimir dismounted and extended his hand once more. Aurora hesitated but accepted. He led her to the door, which opened on its own as they approached. Inside, the air was cold and smelled faintly of damp wood. "This is your home now," he said in a low, steady voice. It was the first time she truly heard him speak. His tone was emotionless, yet carried a gravity that echoed in her mind long after the words faded. She looked around. The house resembled a mausoleum, old portraits on the walls, furniture covered in dust, candles burning without ever having been lit. "I didn't ask for this," she murmured. "Neither did I," he replied, turning away and disappearing down the corridor. Aurora stood alone in the hall, her dress still stained with the dried blood where the blade had touched her skin. Silence in the house was unlike that of the city here. It felt alive, watching her. Outside, the church bells rang again, a distant, mournful sound. Aurora leaned against the wall, breathing deeply, trying to understand what she felt. Fear, yes. Disgust, perhaps. But there was something else too, a spark of curiosity she couldn't extinguish. Who was this man who spoke so little, yet carried centuries of sorrow in his eyes? Why had he agreed to a marriage he didn't want? As those questions consumed her, she climbed the stairs slowly, feeling the weight of fate with every step. Outside, the wind howled, and the candles trembled. In that moment, Aurora understood she wasn't merely stepping into a new house. She was crossing the threshold into something far darker, a world where love and fear blurred together, and where every breath felt like part of a vow that could never be broken. The mansion felt more like a tomb than a home. From the very first day, Aurora sensed that the air inside was different. Cold, dense, almost solid. The windows were tall but covered with heavy curtains that kept out all light. Time itself seemed suspended within those walls. The only sounds were the creaking of wood and the wind striking against the glass panes. There were servants, few in number, all moving in absolute silence like trained shadows that had forgotten how to exist. Every step Aurora took echoed too loudly, as if the house wanted to remind her that she did not belong there. On her first morning, the faint smell of weak coffee and stale bread greeted her in the dining hall. The table was long enough for 20 people, yet only 2 places were set. Vladimir was already there, seated at the far end, his face half hidden in the shadow of the window. "Sit," he said, without lifting his gaze from the papers before him. She obeyed, more out of instinct than will. She served herself quietly, staring at the tasteless meal, dry bread, lukewarm soup, and a pale fruit that looked as though it had lost its color days ago. Trying to be polite, she attempted to start a conversation. "Do you always eat like this?" she asked, forcing a faint smile. "Like what?" "Like it's punishment." He finally looked at her, and for a brief moment she regretted her boldness. There was something in his eyes that silenced all attempts at lightness. "Food is merely necessity. Pleasure is a luxury that comes at too high a price," he replied. Returning to his work, the rest of the meal passed in complete silence. Over the next few days, Aurora noticed that everything in the house followed an almost military rhythm. Fixed hours, discreet orders, rules no one dared to question. At night, heavy footsteps echoed through the corridors, always at the same time. Always the same path from his bedroom to his office. She tried to keep herself busy, but time dragged. The mansion was a labyrinth of locked doors, narrow halls, and old portraits of people who seemed to watch her. She felt observed, even when alone. One afternoon, as she walked down the west corridor, she noticed a door slightly ajar. Pushing it open gently, she found a room unlike any other. A library. It was vast. The shelves reached the ceiling, covered in dust, yet still carrying the sweet, aged scent of forgotten books. A thin beam of light crossed one of the windows, illuminating the floating dust in the air. For the first time, Aurora breathed deeply and felt a hint of peace. She spent hours there, exploring titles, touching the spines, forgetting the world outside. When she finally noticed, night had already fallen. She hurried back to her room, heart racing. She didn't want to be caught, but he was already waiting. "You were in the library," he said. Before she could come up with an excuse, Aurora swallowed hard. "I didn't know it was forbidden." He crossed his arms, studying her in silence. "It isn't. I just don't usually have company there." She hesitated. It's a beautiful place. Beautiful isn't the word I'd use. He stepped closer, close enough for her to feel the restrained warmth of his presence. It's a cemetery of stories, and cemeteries are not good places to seek shelter. Aurora held his gaze, refusing to show fear. Even so, I feel better there than anywhere else in this house. A heavy silence stretched between them. Then he turned and left without another word, leaving her alone with her unease. In the days that followed, Vladimir began to appear more often, always watching, always silent. Sometimes she'd find him standing at the end of the corridor, simply observing, not in a threatening way, but as if trying to understand something that disturbed him. One morning he entered the dining room before she did. Seeing him there, she decided to try once more to break the ice. "Do you ever smile?" she asked, pouring herself some coffee. "There's no reason to. Maybe if you open the curtains, .. He looked at her expressionless. "Light reveals what should remain hidden." Aurora sighed, frustrated. "Or maybe it just shows that things aren't as ugly as they seem in the dark." This time, the corner of his mouth almost moved, not quite a smile, but close enough. It was enough to leave her confused for the rest of the day. Life in the house continued heavy, silent, and slow. Vladimir spent long hours locked in his office, and at night she heard muffled voices, visitors she never saw leave. Sometimes, a metallic sound, like blades being sharpened. Aurora tried to ignore it, tried to make the place bearable. She began opening the curtains little by little, lighting candles, arranging dried flowers in forgotten vases. He noticed one night. He found her in the main hall, pulling the cover off an old piano. He approached silently until she realized he was there. "Are you trying to change the house?" he asked in a low voice. "I just wanted to feel alive. It's not dead." He paused, glancing around. "And some things are better left asleep." Aurora rested her hand on the piano and replied softly, "And some people need to wake up before they become part of the house too." For a brief moment, he looked at her differently, not with coldness, but with something closer to respect. Then he turned and walked away. After that, she began visiting the library every day. There she read, wrote, breathed. It became her refuge, the only space that truly felt hers. Over time, the servants started leaving fresh candles and warm tea on the table, as if they understood that this was how their new mistress endured her days there. One afternoon, she found a book lying open on the table, different from the others. She didn't remember leaving it that way. Inside, there was a loose sheet with a handwritten phrase. "Light never disappears, it only hides where no one dares to look." There was no signature. Aurora placed the note back between the pages and, for the first time since her arrival, felt that the silence in that house might not be made of loneliness alone. Something lived there, a story she didn't yet understand, but one that pulsed beneath the cold walls like a sleeping heart. And, in a strange way, she began to want to uncover it. The days dragged on inside that house, too big, too silent, too sad. The mansion felt like a stone tomb, and she, a living soul trying to breathe within walls that seemed to despise the light. Aurora had already lost track of time. The sun only entered when she allowed it, and even then, it came timidly as if afraid of being cast out. But that morning, something inside her refused to keep merely surviving. Since the wedding, Vladimir had kept his distance, always watching, never speaking. A man of controlled gestures, hard eyes, who seemed to avoid any display of emotion. Everything about him was a wall, and yet, sometimes, something slipped through the cracks. A lingering gaze, a caught breath, a silence that felt almost vulnerable. Aurora began to notice, and she began to test. At first it was small things. She ordered more candles to be lit at night, opened curtains that had been closed for years, asked for the windows to be cleaned. The servants looked fearful, whispering that their master wouldn't approve, but she insisted, smiling in a way they couldn't quite refuse. Slowly, the air began to change. The dust gave way to the scent of flowers, and the main corridor, once a tunnel of shadows, now carried traces of life. It was as if she were pulling the mansion out of a long nightmare. Vladimir noticed everything, even without saying a word. Sometimes, he would pass through the hall and stop, staring at an open curtain, a washed rug, a newly set table. He said nothing, but just looked, then moved on. But there was something in his eyes, discomfort, or was it confusion? One afternoon, Aurora found him in the library. He stood with his back to her, flipping through an old book, sleeves rolled up, his coat tossed over a chair. She approached quietly and, for a moment, saw him as someone else. There was exhaustion in his body, but also a quiet sadness, almost human. "May I stay here?" she asked softly. He didn't answer right away. He just closed the book calmly and turned to her. "It's your house now," he said flatly, eyes returning to the pages. But she caught the small break in his voice, and that was enough to spark something inside her. Little by little, that cold room began to feel like a refuge, and, to her surprise, Vladimir started appearing there too. Never for long, but long enough for her to realize that he liked her presence. One night, during dinner, something unusual happened. The aroma of food filled the hall, something that hadn't happened in a long time. Aurora had asked the servants to prepare simple but flavorful dishes, and she'd helped personally. When he arrived at the table, Vladimir's eyes moved over every detail, the lit candles, the clean tablecloth, the steam rising from the platters. "You changed the rules without permission," he said quietly. She met his gaze, calm. "I just tried to make dinner less sad." He was silent for a moment, then sat down, picked up the utensils, tasted the food, and to everyone's surprise ate. Aurora watched him carefully, trying to read his reaction. When he finished, he lifted his eyes to her. "It's different," he murmured. It was the first time she'd heard anything close to a compliment from him, small, contained, but enough to make her heart race. From that night on, the air between them shifted imperceptibly at first, but real. Their glances began to linger. Their silences stopped being threatening and became tense, as if something was trapped between them, something neither dared to name. One morning she saw him in the courtyard. He wasn't wearing his coat and was cleaning blood from a sword. The sunlight struck him, revealing a restrained, almost savage strength. She stopped, watching. He noticed. "Never seen blood before?" he asked coldly. "I have," she replied. "I've just never seen someone look sad while staring at it." He froze, then sheathed the sword and walked away without a word. But what she saw on his face stayed with her, the pain of someone carrying more than they should. That man, called the executioner, seemed to hate his own role that night. When she found him at the table, something was different. He wasn't wearing his usual armor. His gaze was still firm, but there was a shadow of fatigue. Aurora tried to start a conversation, and for the first time, he didn't cut her off. "Do you always eat alone?" she asked. "Always have," he answered without looking up. "And do you like that?" He stopped moving his utensils, 1 second too, then looked at her. "No one likes eating alone." Aurora, her name and his voice sounded strange, almost intimate. Dinner went on in silence, but the air was heavy in a different way, not with fear, but with something they were both trying to hide. When their hands brushed while reaching for the same cup, a shiver ran through her. He pulled back instantly, but couldn't hide the look in his eyes. It wasn't just tension, it was something more. In the days that followed, the atmosphere between them swung between ice and fire. She kept changing the house, and he kept pretending not to care. But each change seemed to unsettle him more, until one night, she found him again in the library. He was sitting, reading in dim light. The firelight flickered across his face. Aurora hesitated, then stepped in. He looked up, and for the first time, his expression wasn't one of hardness, it was of someone tired of fighting. "If he came to change everything again, then no," he said dryly. She smiled. "Then I'll just sit." Silence. He turned his eyes back to the fire, and she sat beside him, reading. For long minutes, neither said a word. Only the crackle of the fire and their breathing filled the room. When she finally rose to leave, he spoke almost in a whisper. "I don't know what you're trying to find here, but you should be careful." She turned, confused. "Careful with what?" He lifted his eyes and answered softly, yet firm, "With me." And in that instant, she realized there was no fear left, only the dangerous desire to understand the man behind the executioner. The house no longer felt so cold, but maybe that was because hell itself had begun to warm. That house hid its secrets like wounds that never healed, and Aurora felt that with each passing day. She drew closer to their heart. Everything seemed built upon something that should never have existed. The walls whispered stories. The servants avoided her eyes, and Vladimir, no matter how hard he tried to stay in control, had begun to let small fractures show. She saw them in the restrained gestures, in the nights when she found him standing by the window, motionless, as if he carried the weight of the entire world on his back, until, one overcast afternoon, she found what she shouldn't have done. She was searching for an old book in the library when, reaching for a high shelf, a bundle of papers came loose and fell at her feet. Yellowed pages sealed with her family's crest, her father's name inked across the front. Aurora hesitated. Her heart raced. She opened them. The first lines were brief, formal, a promise, a signature. But as she read on, the words began to lose meaning. It was a pact, a blood agreement. Her father, the man she had always believed to be just, that had sealed his own life into the hands of the executioner, and when he failed to keep his part of the bargain, he offered another payment. His daughter Aurora froze, her hands trembling, vision blurring, her stomach twisted, her chest tightened. Now everything made sense. The marriage, her father's silence, Vladimir's heavy gaze. She wasn't a wife. She was payment. "I knew you'd find it one day." His voice came from behind her, deep, steady. Aurora turned slowly. He stood in the doorway, shadowed, as if he had already expected this moment. "So it's true," she said, her voice shaking. "My father sold you. Sold me, because he failed to do whatever it was he promised." He stepped closer, not in anger but in deep exhaustion. "Your father owed me more than money. He owed me his life, and the price was the oath." She swallowed hard. "Oath." Vladimir looked away, as if the words were too heavy. "I carry an old debt. Your family's blood once saved mine long ago. The pact demands that I protect the heir, and when he breaks the cycle, the price falls upon his bloodline." Aurora tried to understand. "So, you had no choice?" "None," he replied coldly, though his eyes betrayed him. "I didn't choose you, Aurora, but the pact cannot be broken. It collects always collects. The silence that followed was thick, almost tangible. She stepped back, eyes glassy. So that's it. I was given to an executioner to pay off an ancient debt. Don't call me that. It's what everyone calls you, she cried, her voice cracking. And you don't deny it. Vladimir clenched his fists but said nothing. Aurora's body trembled. I lost everything. My life, my dreams, my freedom. And for what? To pay a debt that isn't even mine. He watched her silently. There was no denial left. You don't understand, he said quietly. The oath doesn't bind me only to you. It binds me to hell itself. Aurora stepped closer, tears streaming. And what difference does that make to me? I'm still a prisoner here. Her words echoed through the empty hall. The sound of her own voice hurt. She turned her face away, trying to hold back the tears, but failed. They came hot and fast, as if her whole body had finally given up. Vladimir stood frozen for a moment, uncertain, torn. Then, without thinking, he crossed the distance between them and pulled her into his arms. The gesture was abrupt, instinctive. Her body collided with his, and Aurora felt the unexpected warmth of his embrace. He held her tightly, but not roughly, with a strange, careful tenderness. Let me go, she whispered, but her voice broke. Please, stop, he said, his voice low and hoarse. Aurora tried to pull away, but the sound of his heartbeat, fast, strong, human, stopped her. She felt his breath against her hair, his body tense, as if fighting something he couldn't control. Her sobs faded into silence. His hands, once rigid, slowly softened their hold, and a sigh escaped between them, the sound of surrender. Aurora closed her eyes, exhausted. She didn't know what to feel. Anger, pain, but something else throbbed beneath her skin, something that shouldn't exist. That embrace, meant only to console, felt like something more. He pulled back slightly, their faces dangerously close. Vladimir's gaze was intense, caught between guilt and desire. She breathed fast, her face still wet with tears. You must hate me, he murmured. Wish I did, she said honestly. For a second, the world seemed to stop. The firelight flickered across the walls, casting shadows over them both. The air grew thick, almost electric. He lifted his hand, hesitant, and touched her face, a soft, trembling touch, as if he feared breaking her. Aurora felt her whole body shiver. The anger melted into something deeper, more dangerous. Their faces drew closer, slow, inevitable, as if fate itself were pulling them together. But just before their lips met, Vladimir pulled away. I can't, he said, his voice rough. Barely a whisper. Aurora froze, confused. Why? He looked aside, his jaw tense. Because if I start, I won't know how to stop. She took a breath, her heart racing. Do you think I'm afraid of you? He looked at her, serious. I don't know. And then he left, leaving her alone in the hall, her chest burning, her mind in chaos. Aurora stood there, trying to make sense of what was happening inside her. Everything she'd known about him, about the executioner, was starting to crumble. He wasn't just a monster obeying a curse. He was a man bound to something greater, fighting his own fate. And without realizing it, she began to want to free him, even if it meant losing herself in the process. Outside, the rain began to fall heavy, washing over the mansion. But no water could ever extinguish the fire now burning between them. The days began to fall into a strange, silent rhythm. Between Aurora and Vladimir there was a constant tension, invisible, but impossible to ignore. It was as if every glance was an unspoken question, and every gesture carried an expectation neither of them dared to meet. Sometimes, it felt like they spoke without words, only through the weight of silence. He watched her from a distance, restrained, and she, though trying to appear indifferent, felt her heart quicken every time he entered the room. Meals had become a silent battlefield. They sat across from each other, the sound of silverware echoing through the vast empty hall. When their eyes met by chance, the air seemed to shift. Time grew slower, heavier. Each one waited for the other to take the first step, but no one did. It was as if there was an invisible line between them, and crossing it would mean facing something neither was ready for. One cold morning, Aurora asked to go into town. She wanted to buy fabric and see the garden that had long been abandoned. Vladimir hesitated but eventually agreed. He sent 2 guards to accompany her and stood on the grand staircase, watching as she departed, wrapped in a pale shawl. His gaze lingered until the carriage disappeared around the bend in the road. The town seemed smaller than Aurora remembered. The streets were narrow, covered in dry mud, and the people, always in a hurry, fell silent as she passed. Their greetings came with short smiles and discreet bows, but the respect they showed carried something bitter, a respect born of fear. She saw it in their eyes. They didn't see her as a woman, but as the executioner's wife. She stepped into a small shop to buy ribbons and buttons. While waiting, she overheard 2 women talking behind the counter, unaware of her presence. They say he killed his own brother, whispered one, that the blood never washed off his hands. I heard he sold his soul to the devil, murmured the other, lowering her voice, and that anyone who sleeps under the same roof as him is cursed. They both laughed softly, like people speaking of a tragedy far away. Aurora froze. Each word weighed inside her like a stone. She wanted to leave, to tell them they were wrong, that the man they spoke of wasn't the monster they imagined. But she said nothing. She just looked at her reflection in the shop's mirror. The woman staring back looked different, her eyes more mature, her expression tired, a shadow of sadness that hadn't been there before. For the first time she felt pity for him, not out of fear, but from understanding the burden he carried. She returned home in silence. The road felt longer than ever. When she arrived, the mansion was glowing with light, servants rushing back and forth preparing dinner. But Aurora didn't go down to eat. She went straight to the library, her refuge. She needed a place to think, far from the eyes and words that had cut so deep. She sat by the window, watching the thin rain fall outside. Her head spun. The women's voices still echoed in her mind, and with them came Vladimir's image, stern, solitary, sometimes cruel, but never monstrous. What lay behind that man? What had made him so hated? Time slipped away unnoticed. The candles had burned down, and night had taken over the room. She only realized how late it was when she heard footsteps behind her. "It's dark in here," said Vladimir, standing by the door. "Dinner ended a long time ago." Aurora turned quickly. He stood there, tall, with that same restrained expression. But there was something different this time, a quiet curiosity, a trace of care she hadn't expected. "I lost track of time," she replied, unsure of what else to say. He stepped closer. "Did something happen?" She hesitated. "I heard people talking about you today. I imagine it wasn't anything pleasant," he said dryly. "It wasn't. They said awful things." She took a shaky breath, trying to steady her voice. "But they're wrong. I know they are." Vladimir looked away, as if the words couldn't touch him. "I'm used to it," he murmured. "You shouldn't be," she said, firmer than she intended. "No one should ever get used to hatred." He exhaled softly. "Hatred is a more predictable companion than forgiveness, and sometimes easier to bear." Aurora studied him in silence. The dim light from the hallway outlined his face, the strong jaw, the weary eyes. For the first time, she saw him truly human. "They don't know you," she whispered. "You're not the monster they say you are." Vladimir looked up, surprised. He stayed silent for a moment, as if trying to understand why those words affected him. "And what do you think I am then?" Aurora stepped closer, a man carrying a guilt he never asked for, someone trying to live despite it. He didn't move, his eyes locked on hers. There was a war inside him, between the urge to pull away and the need to surrender. "You shouldn't try to understand me, Aurora. It will only hurt you." She shook her head. "It already has. But still, I want to understand." The silence that followed was heavy. They were standing so close now that she could feel his warmth, the rhythm of his heartbeat, the faint scent of smoke and wood. The air between them felt like it was burning. Aurora lifted her face and he didn't step back. "You're not what they say," she whispered again. Vladimir took a deep breath. His hand rose slowly and touched her face. The touch was gentle, but enough to make her tremble. For a brief moment, he hesitated. Then, as if his body decided for him, he pulled her close and kissed her. It was an intense kiss, full of urgency and confusion. Neither of them knew who gave in first, but the moment their lips met, everything else ceased to exist. The anger, the fear, the past all dissolved into a wave of heat and restrained desire. When they finally parted, both were breathless. Vladimir kept his forehead pressed against hers, breathing fast. Aurora closed her eyes, trying to steady her heart. Neither of them spoke, but both knew something had changed. The line that had once separated them had been crossed, and from that moment on, nothing would ever be the same again. The atmosphere between Aurora and Vladimir had changed since the kiss. Something inside them had broken an old barrier made of fear and silence. Now there was a quiet curiosity, a shared pull to be near each other, even if neither dared to say it aloud. Everything unfolded slowly, a touch that lingered longer than it should, a glance that refused to look away, a conversation that began casually and ended in confessions. But there was always that moment inevitable when the distance between them became unbearable, and desire erupted, pulling them back into another kiss. Each one felt different, sometimes soft and unheard, other times desperate, almost frantic. It was as if they were trying to understand what they felt, without knowing how to name it. They met somewhere between danger and tenderness, a fragile line where everything could either collapse or bloom. Aurora began to open up. She spoke more about herself, what she liked, what she feared, what she dreamed of. Vladimir listened quietly, as if storing each word with care. Sometimes he asked subtle questions, other times he just watched her, as though the sound of her voice was enough. He rarely spoke about himself, but over time, Aurora learned how to pull the right threads. A comment, a passing memory, a look that lingered too long, and suddenly, he let himself go. In those moments she discovered fragments of him. She learned that Vladimir came from a house of iron, a family of men taught from childhood that emotion was weakness. His father was a man who had never known affection and had taught him to control everything except his own heart. "In my house, love was something you hid," he confessed one night, his voice low. Aurora stayed silent. She wanted to ask more, but his eyes had already drifted far away, trapped in painful memories. "And now," she asked softly, "do you still think you can't feel?" Vladimir looked away. "I think I can't, but I feel it anyway." After that, the silence between them changed tone. It was no longer uncomfortable. It was a silence full of things said without words, of intentions lost in the nearness of their breathing. As days passed, he began to speak a little about his work. Aurora didn't ask too much, afraid of what she might learn, but sometimes he let dark fragments slip. Missions, names, punishments. It was the side of him that frightened her most, and yet she wanted to understand it. "Have you ever thought about stopping?" she asked one night, her voice soft but steady. He took a long time to answer. "It's what I know how to do," he finally said. "It's what I've always done, and if I asked you to stop..." Vladimir gave a sad smile. "Even if I wanted to. There are promises that can't be broken, Aurora." She knew it was useless to insist, but something inside her still wanted to believe that he could be saved, or that, somehow, she might be the reason he'd try that night. They slept in silence. Aurora woke hours later, in the middle of the night, and saw him sitting by the window, his gaze lost in the dark. For a moment she thought about going to him, but stayed still, just watching his silhouette. The strength and solitude that lived within that man. The following days passed with an odd calm, until one night, when she came down to the hall, she found the place transformed. Candles were lit, a table was set with flowers and crystal glasses, and the fireplace cast a golden glow across the walls. "What is this?" she asked, confused. Vladimir, standing beside the table, looked at her with a quiet smile. "Happy birthday, Aurora." She froze, surprised. "You remembered?" "I could never forget." The dinner was simple but full of meaning. They talked, laughed, drank wine. Aurora felt her heart light for the first time since arriving at that house. At one point, he looked at her with such intensity that the air seemed to disappear between them. "I need to tell you something," he said. "From the first moment I saw you, I knew I was lost." Aurora looked at him, not knowing how to respond. The wine made the world slower, warmer. "Lost," she repeated. Double quotes. "Yes, because I fell in love with you before I even understood who you were." She turned her gaze away, smiling despite herself. "And do you think it's fair to say that now?" she teased, though her voice trembled. "When I'm already completely..." She stopped, unable to finish the sentence. Vladimir leaned closer. "Completely what?" Aurora took a deep breath. "In love with you." The confession came out as a whisper, but he heard it. For a long moment they just looked at each other. Then Vladimir stood, walked around the table, and extended his hand. "Come with me." She took it. He led her to the bedroom where the curtains swayed in the gentle wind. The candles cast dancing shadows across the walls. Aurora's heart beat fast, but there was no fear, only a silent, inevitable surrender. Vladimir stopped in front of her, his eyes fixed on hers. His fingers traced slowly along her face, down to her neck, as if memorizing every line. She placed a hand on his chest, feeling the strong, quick rhythm of his heart. He leaned in. The kiss came soft and deep, as if time had stopped. There was no rush, only restrained desire and tenderness. Slowly, they shed the distance, the fear, the pain that had kept them apart. The bed awaited them, covered in pale sheets and scattered rose petals she hadn't noticed before. They lay down together, and his touch was both firm and gentle, as if holding something precious. Aurora watched him in the candlelight. The man everyone called the executioner, now completely human before her. His body was warm, his eyes intense, but there was sweetness in every gesture. Their kisses grew slower, deeper. Their hands met, exploring, promising, confessing silently what words could never say. She felt safe in his arms, as if the world could disappear and there would still be peace here. When she finally drifted to sleep, her heart was calm for the first time in a long while. He stayed awake a little longer, just watching her face in the glow of the candles. His fingers brushed through her hair, and he smiled a small, genuine smile that night. The executioner ceased to exist. There was only the man who loved and the woman who had made him remember he could still feel. Aurora was sitting by the window, watching the city from above, when she sensed that something had changed. There was tension in the air, something she couldn't immediately name. During the weeks she'd spent in Vladimir's house, she had learned to read the smallest signs. The way the servants moved, the look on his face when he entered or left a room, the silence that lingered before important news arrived. But this time the feeling was sharper, heavier, as if real danger was drawing near. She was right. In the days that followed, rumors began to spread through the narrow streets of the city. Whispered voices spoke of the fall of the executioner, of rivals plotting his destruction. Aurora felt the weight of every word. For the first time, she realized that it wasn't only he who had enemies. She, as his wife, was seen as his weakness. People he trusted or thought he could trust spoke with caution, their eyes shifting away whenever the subject came up. Vladimir noticed the change too, but he didn't warn her right away. He knew that part of the danger lay in how the enemy manipulated fear, and that any warning could be used against her. Aurora, on the other hand, grew restless. His silence seemed to hold more meaning than any explanation he could give. In a moment of courage, she confronted him about the rumors. "There are people who want to see me fall," he said, his voice low and steady. "And you, Aurora, you'd always be the easiest way to do it." A chill ran down her spine. "But I'm not weak. I don't want to be." He looked away, and for a fleeting second, His vulnerability showed. It's not about strength. It's about the fact that they'll never stop trying, and if they ever hurt you, that would be enough to destroy me. Aurora understood then that in his world, any show of care came with a price, and yet, something in her determination made him feel a quiet spark of pride. He knew he needed to protect her not only as his wife, but as the only person who still reminded him of the man he used to be. The attack came on a rainy night. Just as they returned from dinner, a perfectly planned ambush. Two men stepped out of the shadows of the narrow street, blades gleaming, eyes full of hatred and intent. Aurora's heart raced, but Vladimir moved before she could even react. His motions were swift, precise, brutal. He took down the first attacker with a single blow. The second hesitated, seeing the fury in his eyes, but lunged again, terrified. Aurora tried to back away, but Vladimir pulled her behind him, placing his body between her and the threat. "Stay behind me," he ordered, his voice sharp and unshaken. The fight was quick but fierce. He moved with cold precision, every strike deliberate, every motion born from experience. This was his world, his skill, his survival. Each movement carried calculation, discipline, and above all, the unrelenting will to keep her safe. Aurora watched, her heart pounding, as he faced their enemies like shadows cast against his own resolve. When the last one fell, Vladimir finally exhaled. Silence filled the air again, but Aurora couldn't move, adrenaline still coursing through her. She looked at him, noticing the cracks in his usual mask of composure. Sweat glistened on his forehead, his hands trembled slightly, and in his eyes, just for a moment, there was something real, concern for her. "Are you hurt?" she asked, her voice trembling. "I'm fine," he said, but his tone betrayed him. He had exposed himself more than he intended. "You need to stop putting yourself in danger like that." Aurora felt the sting of his words. She wanted to help him, to be part of his world, but she knew there were still lines she couldn't cross. "I won't back away," she said firmly. "I won't let fear tear us apart." Vladimir was silent for a moment, his breathing heavy, before he finally nodded. "Then we'll learn to face it together." That night, back at the mansion, the atmosphere felt different. Despite the danger, something between them had shifted. He didn't need to say it, and she didn't need to ask. They both knew that the attack wouldn't be the last, but they also knew that survival, for either of them, depended on the other. In the days that followed, Vladimir began sharing pieces of his work she had never seen before. He explained strategies, gave her glimpses into the world he'd kept hidden. She learned quickly how to read signs, when to approach, when to remain silent. There were still parts of him she didn't understand, the shadows of his past, the secrets he carried, but now there was trust. Fragile but real. Aurora grew braver, not just as a wife, but as a partner. She started learning simple defense moves, how to sense danger before it struck. Vladimir watched, allowing her to train, though always vigilant, always ready to step in. A quiet respect formed between them, something neither had expected. Each small gesture, each shared silence, strengthened their bond. What struck her most was how much he revealed when he protected her. The coldness that had defined him began to crack, piece by piece. In his eyes, she saw anger, care, and vulnerability, an unsettling mix that made him human in a way she'd never imagined. Aurora also began to notice something else, that her own strength drew him in. It wasn't her gentleness he admired, but her courage, her defiance in the face of fear. Slowly she became part of his world, not just a presence beside him, but a force that shaped his choices, made him feel something beyond duty or survival. That week the city seemed a little less cold. The danger hadn't vanished, but something between them had changed. Aurora and Vladimir were no longer merely a couple learning to coexist. They were allies, partners, equals in their resolve to protect each other. Their intimacy was still restrained, but the glances lingered longer, the touches grew warmer, and an unspoken tension simmered beneath every interaction. When they finally returned to their chamber that night, both were exhausted, yet a strange peace settled over them. Vladimir sat in his usual chair, and Aurora stayed beside him, knowing that whatever happened next, he wouldn't leave her to face it alone. For the first time since she arrived at that house, she felt she could truly trust him, and that, despite the chaos outside, they had carved a small space of safety together. The attack and the conspiracies had made one thing clear: nothing would come as, but they had also proven that together they were stronger than any enemy. His coldness still lingered, but now it was fractured thin enough for her to glimpse the man behind the mask. The night deepened, quiet and heavy. The fire crackled softly in the great hall as they sat side by side, bearing the weight of the world, yet feeling the safety of each other's presence. The battle had ended, but the war for the city on their alliance was far from over, and still, in that fleeting moment, nothing mattered more than the fact that they had survived, and that their bond had grown stronger through every trial. Aurora looked at Vladimir, and he looked back at her. It was no longer about duty or protection, it was trust. A silent step towards something neither could name yet, but both could feel with aching certainty, and for the first time, his mask seemed less impenetrable, letting her glimpse the man behind the executioner. Aurora had never imagined she would reach this point. After months of fear, tension, desire, and revelation, something inside her finally stilled. For the first time, she looked at Vladimir not with dread or anger, but with acceptance of the man he was, the choices he had made, the dark world that surrounded him. She knew life by his side would never be easy. There would always be watchful eyes, whispers in the streets, hidden enemies, but she chose to embrace it all. She chose to live beside him, to share the weight of the curse he carried not just as his wife, but as his accomplice in life. There was no grand declaration, no elaborate speech. It was a quiet decision, made over a simple dinner in the library, where only candlelight filled the room. She looked at him, her eyes full of understanding and tenderness, and said softly, "If this is your world, then it will be mine too." He stayed silent for a few seconds, absorbing every word, as if her acceptance was something he had long waited to hear. Then he stepped closer and took her hands, holding them firmly but gently, as if wanting to show her that together they could face anything. "Do you know what that means?" he asked, his voice rough, thick with emotion. "I do," she replied without hesitation. "It means I'll live every day by your side, even when it's hard, even when the world judges us." His gaze softened. For the first time there was no mask of coldness, no shadow of threat, just him, human, vulnerable, and deeply connected to her. And in that moment, Aurora realized that part of her love for him came from exactly that, being able to see beyond the armor, to see the man no one else could. Months later came the surprise that would change everything between them. Aurora discovered she was pregnant. At first, fear blended with joy. She knew that carrying a child in their world was dangerous, yet something within her bloomed with hope. When Vladimir heard the news, his reaction was one no one would have expected. The rigid, controlled man who showed nothing to others became completely open with her. There were no secrets, no distance. Every gesture was a quiet act of care. Every look, a silent promise of protection. Aurora, in turn, felt closer to him than ever. Between them, love was no longer just desire. It had become something greater. Trust, partnership, surrender. In moments of fear or uncertainty, all they needed was to touch, to hold hands, and they knew they were not alone. The house, once cold and dark, began to change with her presence and the new life she carried. Curtains were opened, windows cleaned, and the aroma of fresh food drifted through the quiet halls. Vladimir didn't interfere. He simply watched with quiet attention, as if learning for the first time that life could still hold color amid the shadows. The months passed and Aurora gave birth to a healthy child. The birth brought a transformation that even Vladimir couldn't ignore. He became more human than ever. Every small act holding the baby, calming it, smiling at tiny discoveries softened the hardness that had always defined him. He didn't lose his essence, nor the firmness that made him who he was, but he had learned that there was room in his world for tenderness, for care, for unconditional love. Aurora discovered that motherhood didn't make her weaker, it made her stronger. She felt whole, as if she had finally found a place where she could be entirely herself, without masks or fear. The child, the bond she now shared with Vladimir, and the deep love that united them created a new rhythm in their lives, filled with small moments of peace and joy. Even in a world that would never be completely safe or predictable, they learned to live with the judgmental eyes of the city. People still whispered, still watched, but the fear that once surrounded them began to fade. Aurora's steady presence at his side showed the world that the man once known as the executioner was not just a monster. He was a man capable of love, of protection, of change, and no rumor or conspiracy could undo that transformation. Their days settled into a quiet routine that brought them a happiness neither had ever known. There were short trips, walks through the city, afternoons in the library, evenings by the fire. Their touch was still there, but now filled with tenderness and ease. Their kisses were no longer desperate. They were natural, fingers intertwined on a walk, long gazes during dinner, the shared care for their child, all of it made up the life they had built together. Their love remained dark and intense, but it was also steady and safe. Aurora accepted that life beside him would always carry challenges, yet there was no doubt in her heart that together they could face them. Vladimir in turn learned to open up more, to trust her completely, to understand that love's strength could outlast any curse or vow that once bound him. In the end, the once gloomy mansion that had felt like a prison became a home. The shadows still lingered, and enemies might still watch from afar, but within the walls they had rebuilt together, there was warmth, life, and hope. Aurora, Vladimir, and their child, a small family bound by love, trust, and mutual respect. They continued to live side by side, facing the world and its adversities. There were no promises of perfection, but there was one unshakable truth. No matter what came, they would face it together. Their love, born from pain, desire, and acceptance, had become the force that sustained them, and so, even in a world haunted by judgment, fear, and shadow, Aurora and Vladimir found their happiness. A happiness not naive, but mature, real, and eternal. Together they embraced the darkness, turned fear into trust, and built a future that, though uncertain, overflowed with love, care, and an intimacy that could never be broken in the stillness of the night. With their child sleeping between them, Aurora looked at Vladimir and smiled. He looked back at her, and in his gaze was everything: recognition, tenderness, and the unspoken promise that no matter what came, they would always be together. And so, between shadows and flickering light, love and quiet devotion, they lived not perfectly, but deeply, endlessly, happily ever after.